In the spring of 1809, on the banks of the Danube, the unstoppable met the immovable. The conqueror of Europe, Napoleon Bonaparte, a man who had humiliated every continental rival and redrawn the map of nations, suddenly halted. Not by a cunning coalition, not by Russian winter or Spanish guerrillas, but by an old enemy, underestimated and reborn. On a muddy river island outside Vienna, the Battle of Aspern-Essling was Napoleon's first major defeat in a decade of near-mythical victories. It did not just cost him thousands of men and one of his dearest friends. It shattered the illusion of invincibility. But how did the greatest general of his age at the height of his power walk into a trap? And why does this battle, often overshadowed by Austerlitz or Waterloo, still echo as a moment of reckoning in the Napoleonic saga? This is not just a story of tactics and formations. It is a lesson in pride, misjudgment, and the brutal limits of human will. In 1809, the French Empire dominated Europe. From Lisbon to Warsaw, Napoleon Bonaparte had either crushed, coerced, or allied every major power with one lingering exception: Austria. Ever since its catastrophic defeat at Austerlitz in 1805, the Habsburg Empire had been quietly preparing for revenge. And now, with French forces bogged down in Spain and Britain offering gold and support, the moment seemed right. At the heart of this gamble was Archduke Charles of Austria, a reformer among aristocrats. He had studied the causes of Austria's past defeats and resolved to reshape his army. The model, Napoleon himself. Under Charles, the Austrian army adopted the core system, increased flexibility, and reformed training and command. But numbers tell only part of the story, and Charles understood what many of his peers did not. Napoleon was not invincible, just unchallenged. The spark was struck in April 1809, when Austrian forces invaded Bavaria, France's southern ally. Charles hoped for a swift advance before Napoleon could react, but the Austrian timetable quickly collapsed under its own weight, bogged down by weather, confusion, and supply issues. Still, the French army in Germany was in disarray. Napoleon was hundreds of miles away in Paris. His deputy, Marshal Berthier, though brilliant as chief of staff, floundered in the field. By the time Napoleon returned to the front, his corps were scattered, and one Davout's Third Corps was dangerously exposed at Regensburg. Charles seized the opportunity. He ordered his forces to converge and crush Davout, but Davout, the Iron Marshal, would not go down so easily. At Teugn-Hausen, his men repulsed the Austrians in brutal, close-quarters fighting. Within days, Napoleon launched a counteroffensive so rapid and precise that historians would later call it the Four-Day Campaign. He struck like a thunderbolt, pushing back Austrian forces at Ebensburg, Landshut, and Aigues-Mortes. Towns fell, bridges were taken in daring assaults, the Austrian left wing was shattered, and Charles ordered a withdrawal behind the Danube. Napoleon had won, or so it seemed. He took Vienna without a fight on 13 May. But Charles had learned well. He refused to offer battle in the open. Instead, he crossed to the far side of the Danube, marshalling his full army near Marchfeld, on the very same plain where centuries earlier the Holy Roman Empire had once clashed with Mongol invaders. Now, it would be French steel versus Austrian resolve. Napoleon believed the Austrian army was finished. He believed Charles would retreat again. He believed 80,000 French troops could force a crossing and defeat 110,000 Austrians. He was wrong on all counts. The Danube was not just a river. It was a barrier wide, fast, and treacherous. To cross it meant building pontoon bridges between islands, exposed to currents, enemy fire, and fate itself. On the night of 20 May, French engineers worked furiously under torchlight to build the crossing. By the next day, Masséna's 4th Corps and part of the cavalry had reached the left bank, holding the villages of Aspern and Essling, but behind them, the bridges faltered. Austrian barges, weighted with stone, were floated downstream to smash into the French pontoons, severing supply lines at the worst possible moments. Napoleon's first error had been underestimating Charles. His second was overconfidence in the river crossing. And his third was deploying too few men to hold his position. By afternoon on 21 May, the full Austrian army, 90,000 strong, advanced in 5 columns. They did not hesitate. They did not retreat. They came on with purpose. The French were outnumbered and half isolated. The first assault came at Aspern, around 4 or 5 p.m. General Molitor's men clung to the village, firing from windows and garden walls, retreating, then counterattacking in savage street combat. Napoleon, sensing the pressure, sent cavalry to charge the Austrian columns, but Austria had a new tactic. Their infantry had trained in the battalion mass formation, a tight, crude, but effective defense against cavalry. Horsemen hurled themselves at walls of bayonets and fell. At 6 p.m., Archduke Charles ordered Bellegarde to take Aspern at any cost. He led from the front, sword drawn, a general born not just of lineage but of fire. Aspern fell. Napoleon responded instantly, sending in reinforcements to reclaim the village. Again, the French surged forward. Again, the Austrians pushed back. Meanwhile, at Essling, Marshal Lannes held the line. Veteran cuirassiers counterattacked after the first Austrian assault. But their leader, General d'Espagne, was hit by grapeshot and mortally wounded. At 9 p.m., the 5th column joined the fray, assaulting Essling. In a final effort before nightfall, the attack failed, and across the blood-soaked field, silence crept in, broken only by the cries of the wounded and the splash of water under shattered bridges. That night, 2nd Corps and the Imperial Guard crossed the Danube, bringing Napoleon's force to 71,000 men and 150 guns. He was still short of Davout's corps, and the bridge was broken again. Yet he chose to attack. Dawn on 22 May 1809 rose over a battlefield, smothered in smoke, mud, in the echo of agony. In the villages of Aspern and Essling, men had slept beside the dead in cellars, gardens, shattered barns, their uniforms stiff with blood. Muskets clutched as if sleep might turn into a final skirmish. At 4 a.m., Napoleon ordered 2nd Corps to attack the Austrian center, but before the French could strike the heart, they had to regain control of the flanks. Aspern, once again, was the focus of desperate combat. The young guard, hand-picked veterans and recruits alike, advanced into fire. By 7 a.m., they had retaken the village inch by inch, a butcher's dance of bayonets and close musket volleys inside alleyways and rubble. At Essling, the Austrians attacked anew. This time, they briefly seized control, only to be thrown back by a counterattack led by General Lasalle's cavalry and the young guard. Now, with both flanks relatively stable, Napoleon moved in for the kill. The center would be split. Marshal Lannes, one of Napoleon's oldest comrades, was given command of the assault. Alongside him rode General Saint-Hilaire, a veteran of Austerlitz and Jena, known for his iron discipline and calm under fire. They led their men into the open, But the open was a killing field. Austrian cannon, arranged along the line and reinforced by grenadier reserves, unleashed cascades of iron upon the French ranks. Solid round shot tore through bodies in linear paths. Canister blast decimated columns. General Saint-Hilaire, leading from the front, had his foot torn off by a cannonball. He was carried from the field and died days later. The French attack faltered. They had braved Austrian fire before, but never like this. Never without momentum or a bridge behind them. At 2 p.m., tragedy struck again. The bridge over the Danube, the sole artery between Napoleon's army and his reserves, ammunition, and retreat collapsed. Not sabotage, not enemy action. Just the river and its cruel indifference to human plans. Napoleon was now fighting with what he had: no reinforcements, no more powder wagons, no fallback route if the line broke. Aspern was lost once again. In Essling, the Austrians surged, taking half the village. The defenders fought back with sheer will, holding streets and stone granaries until their muskets overheated in their hands. But it was over. At 4 p.m., Napoleon made a decision he had rarely made in his career. He ordered a retreat, not a rout, not a collapse, a methodical fighting withdrawal to the island of Lobau, shielded by cavalry and rearguard action. One final blow awaited him. In the last hours of battle, a cannonball tore through the legs of Marshal Lannes, a man Napoleon once called the Roland of my army. The surgeons amputated both limbs. Lannes Lingofortes. Napoleon visited him in person, clasped his hand, and wept. When Lannes died, Napoleon reportedly said, "I had him too young. I loved him too much." This was more than the loss of a general. It was the loss of a friend, a brother in arms, a part of the emperor's soul torn from the living world and buried on a muddy island of the Danube. The Battle of Aspern-Essling ended with both sides bloodied and stunned. Napoleon had lost around 0 men, nearly a third of his force. Austria suffered similar numbers, but they held the field. And for the first time in a generation, the world could say, Napoleon has been defeated. History is rarely written in straight lines. The Battle of Aspern-Essling did not end the war. It did not break Napoleon's army. Within weeks, reinforcements arrived. Within months, Napoleon would defeat Archduke Charles at the Battle of Wagram, a bloody affair that restored France's strategic upper hand. But something had changed. For the first time since the Italian campaigns of the 1790s, Napoleon had been bested in open battle, not by guerrillas, not by frostbite or starvation, but by a conventional army, well led and well prepared. The myth of French invincibility cracked that day, and within the crack, Europe saw possibility. It was a lesson Napoleon would never fully internalize. At Aspern-Essling, he learned the cost of haste, of logistical oversight, and most of all of hubris. Yet within a year, he would march toward Russia with an even greater army and an even greater belief in destiny. The Austrians, too, learned. Archduke Charles, though outmaneuvered at Wagram, had proven that a modernized, centralized command could challenge the greatest general of the age. But his triumph was bittersweet. His victory was not decisive. And soon, Austria would be forced into yet another peace with France, temporary, fragile, and doomed. What remains of Aspern-Essling today, a quiet suburb of Vienna, two villages now blurred by time, trees, and tram lines. Yet if you walk the fields, you can still find it. The old stone granary where Lannes bled, The buried foundations of bridges torn by river and fire, and the echo of cannon in the bones of the earth. This was the battle where Napoleon bled. And though he would rise again, the memory lingered. Victory is a tide, but defeat is an anchor. Napoleon Bonaparte, the Titan under pressure. By 1809, Napoleon was more than an emperor. He was an idea to his enemies. He was a monstrous usurper, the Corsican upstart who had destroyed monarchies and spread revolution like a wildfire across Europe. To his followers, he was destiny in human form, a man who could look across the Alps and see a battlefield, not an obstacle. But the man who rode into Vienna in May 1809 was not the same lean, ruthless general of Marengo or Ulm. He was now Emperor of the French, ruler of millions, commandant of armies that stretched from the Baltic to the Tagus. His victories were piling higher than the ambitions that drove them, but so too were the cracks. In Spain, what he believed would be a quick occupation had turned into a bloody guerrilla nightmare. At home, the empire groaned under the weight of conscription and taxes, and around him, the ranks of marshals and advisors were increasingly dominated by men who dared not challenge his judgment. Napoleon's strength was never just his genius. It was the speed at which he adapted, the way he turned chaos into choreography, disorder into dance. But Aspern-Essling was the first time in a decade that the dance failed. Not because the steps were wrong, but because the floor gave way beneath his feet. He had bet everything on a river crossing, a river that he could not tame. When the bridges broke and the Austrians charged, there was no masterstroke to save him, only blood, shouts, and a retreat under fire. In private, he showed little emotion. He buried pain under work. He summoned reinforcements, reorganized the army, and planned Wagram like a machine winding up again. But in truth, the mask had slipped. Napoleon had glimpsed the edge of his own myth, and it stared back. Archduke Charles, the reluctant genius. Karl Ludwig of Austria, younger brother to Emperor Francis II, was no romantic warrior. He did not crave glory, nor wield charisma like a blade. He was methodical, serious, often austere, a soldier of ink, of staff work, of doctrine. But beneath the cold surface lay a deep intelligence and a quiet resolve. At Austerlitz, he had not commanded. At Aspern, he would. Charles had reformed the Austrian army, not just in structure, but in spirit. He introduced new tactics, modeled corps on the French system, and emphasized training over ceremony. A radical departure in a world still addicted to powdered wigs and parade ground splendor. Yet Charles remained haunted by the weight of Austria's past failures, by the political games of the court, and by his own frailty, for he had long suffered from epilepsy, a condition treated in that age with superstition and shame. In many ways, Aspern-Essling was his moment of liberation. He stood in the front lines, urging troops forward with sword in hand. He ordered bold attacks. He trusted his reforms. And for once they worked, Napoleon did not expect him to stand and fight. Charles did both. Yet his victory brought no triumph. No parades, no monuments in marble. His reward was silence and ultimately resignation. For when Wagram came and defeat followed, Charles was cast aside by the Habsburg court, a scapegoat for failures he had long warned of. History rarely rewards quiet greatness, but Charles, in that moment by the Danube, proved that empires could still produce warriors who thought before they fought and who knew how to die without spectacle. Marshal Lannes, the heart of an empire. If Napoleon was the brain and Berthier the nerves, then Lannes was the heart of the Grande Armée. Born to a poor family in Gascony, Lannes was a man who rose not by blood, but by battlefield valor, a sergeant turned marshal, a commoner made legend. He was fiery, blunt, and utterly fearless. At Montebello, he charged headlong into enemy lines. At Austerlitz, he fought shoulder to shoulder with Murat, holding the French center under relentless fire. At Aspern, he took command of Essling, a village that became a graveyard of bravery. His men loved him not for his titles, but because he bled with them. They saw him in the trenches, mud to his knees, sabre drawn, eyes scanning the smoke for enemy movements. And it was there, near the end, that a cannonball took both his legs. When Napoleon came to his bedside, it is said they spoke not as emperor and marshal, but as brothers. Their final conversation remains lost to history. But the wound was deeper than the flesh. Lannes' death was not just a military loss. It was a personal fracture, a reminder to Napoleon that mortality walks with kings as it does with beggars. And for the men of France, it was the moment the war stopped being glory and became grief. Closing reflection, the river remembers. The Danube, in time, forgets. It buries bullets under mud, washes bone into sediment, and carries the memory of nations down to the Black Sea. But history remembers not just the victories, but the almost, the pauses, the defeats, the battles where giants stumbled. Aspern-Essling was a fracture line, a moment when the steel of empire struck and split. It was where Napoleon learned that even rivers have teeth, and where Austria Long, the beaten child of Europe, found its voice. It is easy to romanticize war, to dress it in uniforms and music, to carve it into marble, but in the fields outside Vienna, it was none of that. It was rain, blood, smoke, and silence. And for those who survived a lesson written in wounds, empires do not fall in one blow, but they crack in the silence between battles. And someday, those cracks return. The Battle of Aspern-Essling was not the end of Napoleon, but it was the beginning of the end. The moment the aura of inevitability cracked, however briefly, and the world saw the man behind the myth stumble. In the years to come, Napoleon would fight larger battles, command bigger armies, win more victories, but he would also begin to misjudge, to overreach, to believe his star could not fall. The Danube showed him otherwise, and in its muddy currents, the memory of that lesson still drifts. If you found this story compelling, if you believe history's most powerful lessons often lie in its lesser-known moments, consider joining us on the next deep dive into the past. Here on Legacy Files, we don't just tell you who won, we uncover why it mattered and why it still matters now. Subscribe for more cinematic history, untold battles, and the truths behind the turning points. Until next time, remember, history doesn't whisper. It waits,